The blind man showed his aversion towards the guide dog the first time they met, but what the dog did for him afterward would make him cry. The sun was barely starting to rise on the horizon, casting its golden light over the fields around Hudson's small farm. In the middle of that picturesque scene, a litter of Labrador puppies was running around in the grass, but one in particular stood out: Quill. He wasn't the biggest or the fastest, but something in the way he calmly observed everything around him caught the eye. Hudson noticed it from day one. "This little guy has something special," he murmured to himself, gently petting Quill's soft head. In his first few weeks of life, Quill stayed close to his mother and siblings, enjoying the warmth of the nest and Don Hudson's gentle touch. But it wasn't long before the old breeder decided it was time for Quill to take on a bigger purpose. Hudson had been raising dogs for years and knew a good character when he saw one. This puppy could be more than just a pet, he thought. So, after a few phone calls, he managed to get in touch with a training center in Mexico City that specialized in training guide dogs for people with visual disabilities. A few weeks later, the day of the farewell arrived. Hudson stood by the van that would take Quill to his new life. "You're going to be okay, Quill," he said with a smile, though there was a slight sadness in his voice. "Make me proud, will you?" Quill, as if he understood his caretaker's words, wagged his tail softly and lifted his head, displaying that same calm, curious gaze. The journey to Mexico City was long. Quill curled up in the back seat, watching out the window as the scenery shifted from open fields to a jungle of buildings and bustling streets. When they finally arrived at the training center, a large and organized place, Quill felt overwhelmed, but his naturally calm demeanor helped him adapt quickly. He was welcomed warmly, and from the very first moment, Quill knew this would be his new home, at least for a while. The center was run by Mrs. Teresa, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a heart full of patience. Teresa had been training guide dogs for over 20 years and could tell with just one look if a dog had what it took to do the job. The moment she saw Quill, she knew there was something special about him. "This guy has what it takes," she commented to her partner Don Carlos as they watched Quill on his first day of training. "He's calm, but also very attentive. That's exactly what we look for." Days at the center weren't easy for Quill. Every morning, training sessions would begin bright and early. First came the basic exercises, learning to walk alongside a person, stopping when necessary, ignoring distractions. But soon, the training grew more complex. Teresa and Carlos took him to noisy streets, to markets filled with the strong scent of street food, and to plazas where children were running and playing. All of it was to prepare Quill for the real situations he would face as a guide dog. "Let's go, Quill! Stay focused!" Carlos would say as they walked through a bustling street. Cars sped by close and horns blared, but Quill didn't let anything distract him. He learned to stop before crossing a street, to wait patiently until it was safe, and to always stay at his handler's side. Teresa watched with pride as the once timid yet curious puppy became a dog capable of facing any challenge with calm and confidence. One of the toughest exercises for Quill was learning to navigate a crowded market, the kind of bustling place where people haggle prices and the smell of tacos al pastor mixes with the sounds of street musicians. It was chaos, but Quill learned to focus on what mattered: his guide's safety. When he managed to lead Teresa through the maze of stalls without missing a beat, she petted his head and said with a smile, "Very good, boy. You're doing great." Over the months, Quill faced numerous tests to prove he had what it took to be a guide dog. One of the final evaluations was a walk through downtown Mexico City during rush hour. Teresa and Carlos watched from a distance, ready to step in if necessary. Quill had to lead his human guide, a center volunteer, through busy crosswalks full of people, up and down stairways, and along streets crowded with cars and motorcycles. The van pulled up in front of an old building in the heart of Mexico City, just at dusk. The streetlights flickered softly, illuminating the entrance to the building where Weston Morales lived. Quill, sitting in the back seat, observed everything around him with the same calm that had set him apart since he was a puppy. Teresa turned off the engine and looked back at Quill. "Well, boy, it's time to meet your new friend," she said in a soft but firm voice. She knew this moment would be crucial for both of them. Weston Morales was already waiting by the building's door. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and an expression that was always alert. His posture was rigid, like he was ready for anything, but his eyes, even behind the dark glasses, revealed a hint of vulnerability. He'd lost his sight in an accident a few years ago, and his life had changed drastically ever since. For a man who had always been independent, relying on others to get around was a hard pill to swallow. That's why the idea of having a guide dog hadn't appealed to him from the start. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morales," greeted Teresa with a warm smile. "This is Quill. He'll be your guide if all goes well." Weston simply nodded, barely moving, his lips pressed into a thin line. "All right," he murmured, with a mix of resignation and discomfort in his voice. He hadn't really had a choice but to agree to this meeting, though he still wasn't convinced. Teresa took Quill's leash and handed it to Weston. "If you'd like, we can start with something simple," she said. "Let's walk a little around the block, and you can see how it feels." Weston hesitated for a moment before taking the leash. When his fingers touched Quill's collar, there was a slight tension in the air, as if they were both trying to understand each other without words. Quill, on his part, remained calm, looking up at Weston with bright, steady eyes. He didn't pull on the leash or get restless. He simply waited, giving Weston the space he seemed to need. Quill had learned during his training that sometimes people also needed time to build trust, just like dogs. "Let's go, Quill," Weston finally said, almost like he was testing the words. They started walking, and the quiet of the street was broken only by the soft sound of their steps. At first, Weston walked with short, tense steps, as if he was afraid of stumbling at any moment. But Quill moved with precision, guiding firmly but without pushing. When they reached the crosswalk, Quill stopped, making sure there was no traffic before moving forward. Teresa followed a few steps behind, watching every detail closely. As they walked, Weston began to relax his shoulders a little. Quill stopped at every corner, waiting for the right moment to cross, and never strayed from the path. There was a subtle control in his movements, like he understood that his job was to protect his new friend. At the end of the walk, Weston stopped and let out a small sigh, a mix of relief and surprise. "He did well," he murmured, almost as if he didn't want to admit it. Teresa smiled, aware that this was a big step. After that first walk, Teresa suggested meeting several times a week so Weston and Quill could get to know each other better. The following days were a mix of small victories and challenges. Sometimes Weston would get frustrated when he felt like he was losing control, but every time that happened, Quill would simply stay still, waiting until Weston was ready to try again. There was a calming presence in the dog, a peace that began to affect the man too. One day, after several weeks of practice, Weston decided he wanted to try something more challenging. "Let's go to the park," he said, almost as if he were daring himself. Teresa nodded, and without another word, handed the leash to Weston. Walking together, Quill guided him through the busy streets, weaving around hurried passers-by, children playing nearby, and bicycles whizzing past. It was then that something changed in Weston. For the first time, he stopped hearing the city's noise and started focusing only on Quill's movements, trusting him to lead him through the chaos. When they reached the park, Weston stopped under the shade of a tree and, without a word, sat on a bench. Quill settled at his feet, lying down with his front paws stretched out, but his ears still alert. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shadows that danced on the ground. Weston stayed silent for a long time, breathing in the fresh air and feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Tranquility. Quill's presence had allowed him, if only for a few minutes, to forget about his own limitations. "I didn't think this would work," he said suddenly, not directing his voice at anyone in particular, but knowing Teresa was listening from a distance. "But it looks like I was wrong." Quill lifted his head when he heard Weston's voice, wagging his tail slightly, as if he just wanted to make sure everything was okay. In the days that followed, that small spark of trust began to grow. Each walk became more natural, and Weston started to see Quill not only as a guide but as a companion. One afternoon, while they were crossing one of the busiest avenues, a car stopped abruptly at the sight of them and Weston flinched. But Quill stayed steady, guiding his friend to the other side of the street without hesitation. Weston tightened his grip on the leash, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was because of a sudden feeling of safety. Once they got home, he crouched down and petted Quill's head. "You're smarter than I thought," he said with a smile. It was the first time Weston spoke directly to the dog, acknowledging what he had done for him. And though the words were simple, they held something that couldn't easily be explained. Gratitude. Quill, as always, just wagged his tail, happy to have done his job well. Mornings started to have a different rhythm in Weston's small apartment. Before, dawn was a quiet struggle against laziness and uncertainty. But now, each day began with the sound of Quill's paws moving softly across the floor, as if he knew exactly when to wake up his friend. Weston, still half asleep, could feel Quill coming closer, nudging his nose against his hand, waiting for the signal to go out for a walk. It was a subtle change, but a profound one. Weston no longer hesitated so much about leaving the house. The first time he tried going to the market alone, without the help of a neighbor or family member, he'd felt a sharp stab of fear that almost made him turn back. However, with Quill by his side, the noisy, crowded streets seemed less intimidating. Now, Weston trusted his loyal companion to lead him through street vendors, tables stacked with fresh fruits and vegetables, and hurried pedestrians. One day, as they walked through the market, Weston stopped in front of a stand selling traditional sweets. He suddenly remembered how he used to buy alegrias, those amaranth candies, for his grandchildren when they were little. He stood there for a moment, lost in thought, until he felt a gentle tug on the leash from Quill, as if telling him that everything was okay, that they could continue whenever he was ready. Weston smiled to himself, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel nostalgic without the bitterness that usually came with those memories. Life with Quill wasn't always easy, but Weston was adapting. There were still days when he would trip over furniture in the apartment, especially when he was distracted. One afternoon, while trying to reach the remote he'd left on the table, he lost his balance and fell, lightly bumping his elbow. Before he could even try to get up, he felt something soft and warm next to him. Quill had rushed over, gently biting onto the sleeve of Weston's shirt and tugging with a patience that only a dog like him could have. Weston sat up, catching his breath, while Quill lay down beside him, his warm body providing comfort. "You're a good boy, Quill," Weston murmured, stroking his soft fur. I don't know what I'd do without you." Nights were the hardest times for Weston. When the city quieted down and the noise of cars faded away, the loneliness became more noticeable. Before having Quill, nights were long and heavy, filled with memories that never seemed to leave him in peace. But now, with Quill lying at his feet, the weight felt a little lighter. One of those nights, after dinner, Weston sat in his favorite armchair and called Quill, who approached slowly, wagging his tail. "Come here, buddy," Weston said, patting the space next to him. Quill settled down close by, resting his head on Weston's leg, and Weston began to speak in a low voice, almost as if he were reminiscing to himself. "You know, Quill, I used to go to Chapultepec on the weekends. I loved sitting by the lake, watching kids run, young people riding bikes, and couples walking hand in hand. It all seemed so simple, yet so beautiful." Quill's dark, attentive eyes followed Weston's every move. Though he couldn't understand the words, he could feel the soft, wistful tone of his friend's voice, and he stayed still, offering his silent companionship. "I used to take my grandson, Antonio. He always wanted me to buy him ice cream even when it was cold. He'd tell me it tasted better when it was cold," Weston continued, letting out a small laugh. Maybe he was right. For a moment, silence filled the space between them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that only exists between true friends, a silence that says, "Everything words cannot." "Thank you for being here," Weston finally said, realizing that what he felt for Quill was more than gratitude. It was a deep connection that gave him the strength to face another day, even when he didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Over time, Weston started to see Quill as more than just a guide dog. Their bond had grown to the point where every gesture, every small movement, was a form of communication that went beyond words. It was as if Quill could read Weston's heart, always knowing when to come a little closer or when to sit by his side in silence. One morning, as he was making coffee, Weston looked out the window and saw the clear sky with a bright sun promising a good day. "Today, we're going to Chapultepec, Quill," he announced, almost as if it were a spontaneous decision. He hadn't been back to the park since losing his sight, and the thought of going back filled him with a mix of anxiety and excitement. But if he'd learned anything in recent months, it was that he could trust Quill, and that trust gave him the courage to try the things he once loved. The subway ride was peaceful. People looked at Quill with curiosity. Some children pointed and smiled, but Quill remained unfazed, focused on his job. When they arrived at the park, the scent of damp earth and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind filled the air. Weston took a deep breath, feeling his heart race, and let Quill guide him to the lake, the place that had been so special to him for so many years. When they arrived, he sat on a bench and let the memories flow. Around him, he could hear the soft splashing of water, the murmurs of people, and the sound of bicycles passing by. Quill settled beside him, watching calmly, as if he understood that this moment meant more than just a simple visit to the park. Weston closed his eyes and let the sun warm his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced since losing his sight. "You know, Quill," he said softly, "today, I finally feel like I've come home." Quill didn't answer, but he lifted his head and rested his nose on Weston's knee, wagging his tail gently, as if to tell him that everything would be all right. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Weston's small apartment, filling the room with a warm glow. It was a quiet morning, but Weston felt unusually anxious. While buttoning his shirt, he thought about the day ahead. Today, for the first time in years, He was going to attend a meeting at the neighborhood's cultural center, the same place he used to visit every week before the accident that changed his life. He took a deep breath, and though part of him still hesitated, he felt the confidence he'd regained thanks to Quill. Quill, as always, was ready at his side with the leash in his mouth and his tail wagging slowly, waiting for the signal to go out. There was something comforting in the routine they'd created together. Every time they got ready to leave, Quill always came close to him, making sure Weston felt secure, as if to remind him that no matter how many times they did this, he'd be there, guiding him. As they stepped out of the building, the cool morning air filled Weston's lungs. As they walked through the neighborhood streets, everything seemed a little brighter, a little more alive. The sounds that used to feel intimidating were now familiar signals he could recognize, thanks to Quill's guidance. "Let's go, buddy," he said softly, and Quill started walking with his firm, steady stride. When they arrived at the cultural center, Weston could hear people laughing, talking excitedly, the sound of coffee cups clinking on saucers and the gentle echo of music in the background. Everything was so familiar and yet so different at the same time. As he walked in, there was a brief moment of silence as everyone saw him cross the door with Quill. Then, a familiar voice called out from the back of the room, "Weston! Well, look who's back!" It was Don Miguel, an old friend who used to play chess with him in that very place. Weston smiled broadly, something he hadn't done so naturally in a long time. People gathered around to greet him, and amidst hugs and words of welcome, they all looked at Quill with admiration. "So, this is the one who's brought our old friend back to us," Doña Clara said, pointing to Quill with a smile. "Looks like you've got yourself a great helper, Weston." He nodded, gently patting Quill's head. "I couldn't have done it without him," he replied, and those words were truer than anyone could imagine. After the meeting, as they walked back home, Weston felt lighter. It was as if something inside him had been unlocked, like a small piece of his old life had fallen back into place. He felt it was just the beginning of something bigger, a chance to reconnect with those he had left behind. Days later, it was Dia de los Muertos, a celebration that had always meant a lot to him and his family. Since losing his wife, Weston had avoided participating in the festivities, fearing that the memories would be too painful. But this year was different. He decided he wanted to be part of the parade in the city center, something he never would have imagined doing alone. With Quill, he didn't feel alone. Downtown Mexico City was alive that night. The streets were full of colorful altars, candles illuminated faces painted as skulls, and the scent of marigolds filled the air. Weston stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of the drums echoing through the ground beneath his feet. "Come on, Quill," he said in a calm, steady voice. He walked slowly through the crowd, letting the sounds and energy of the night surround him, while Quill stayed by his side, guiding him with his usual precision and calm. As they moved through the parade, Weston could feel his wife's presence beside him, as if his memories weren't a burden, but a force pushing him forward. The bright colors, traditional songs, and laughter of the people. It all made him feel like he was part of something much bigger than himself. And for the first time in years, he let that feeling fill him completely. It was as if, thanks to Quill, he could honor the past without being lost in it. A few days after the celebration, Weston decided to do something he'd put off for a long time. It was a cloudy afternoon when he asked Quill to guide him to the cemetery. He brought fresh flowers and candles, as he used to when his wife was alive. The walk to the cemetery was quieter than the bustling city streets, but the weight of memories made each step a bit harder. However, Quill guided him gently, with that steady pace that seemed to tell him there was no rush, that they could take all the time they needed. When they reached his wife's grave, Weston knelt slowly, placing the flowers beside the headstone. He remained silent, staring at the letters carved into the stone, allowing the tears to fall without shame. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I think I'm starting to find my way back." He turned to Quill, who was sitting beside him, watching with his calm, deep eyes. "Thank you, friend," he said, gently stroking Quill's head. "Thank you for giving me the strength I thought I'd lost." Quill didn't move, but his presence was like an anchor, something that kept Weston connected to the present without being swept away by the sadness of the past. Weston stayed there for a long time, speaking in a low voice, remembering happy moments and little details that had made his life with his wife so special. And as he spoke, he felt that the wound in his heart, though it would never fully heal, didn't hurt quite as much as before. Quill remained by his side, as if he understood this was a sacred moment, something he needed to protect with the same devotion he showed when guiding Weston through the city streets. The days began to pass slowly, and though Weston and Quill's routine remained the same, there was something different in the air. Fall brought a light chill that hinted at the arrival of winter, and with it, a feeling of change that Weston couldn't ignore. Quill, his faithful companion, had started to show signs of fatigue. He was no longer the young dog full of energy who could guide him on long walks without stopping. Now, after a few blocks, Quill would fall a bit behind, breathing more heavily than usual. Weston noticed these changes, but he refused to accept them. Each time Quill stopped to take a break, he would gently pet him and say, "Come on, buddy, just a little further." Quill, always eager to please, would lift his head and continue on, though his steps were slower. It was as if the dog knew that Weston needed that small effort to avoid facing the reality that was approaching. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, something different happened. Quill, who always stayed a few steps ahead to guide Weston, suddenly stopped completely. Weston felt the pull on the leash and stopped too, a bit confused. "What's wrong, Quill?" he asked, leaning down to touch the dog's head. But Quill just stayed there, breathing deeply, as if he needed to gather his strength before moving on. Weston felt a lump form in his throat. "There's no rush, buddy," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. They sat down on a nearby bench, and for a moment, Weston allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had been ignoring. He knew that Quill was aging, but the thought of losing his companion was something he wasn't ready to face. He stayed there, resting his hand on Quill's back, feeling the slow and steady rhythm of his breathing, as if trying to memorize that moment. A few days later, Weston decided it was time to find someone who could help him understand what was happening with Quill. He thought of Doña Teresa, the woman who had trained Quill and who had always been kind to them. So he picked up the phone and called her, explaining in a worried voice what he had noticed. Teresa listened in silence, and at the end, she told him she would come to visit the next day. When Teresa arrived, Quill recognized her instantly. His eyes lit up for a moment, and he wagged his tail slowly, as if he remembered his days at the training center. Teresa knelt to pet him, and her experienced hands gently examined him, looking for signs to confirm her suspicions. Then she turned to Weston and sighed, her expression full of understanding. "Weston, Quill is getting older," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He has arthritis. It's common in older dogs. especially in big breeds like him. He can't walk as much as before, and there will be days when he simply needs to rest. Teresa's words hit Weston's heart like a stone. He knew she was right, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way he'd been avoiding. "Is there anything I can do?" Weston asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Teresa gave him a gentle smile and nodded. "Of course. He needs more breaks, shorter walks. You can also give him supplements to help with his joints, and make sure he doesn't push himself too hard. Quill has been an excellent companion, but now it's he who needs to be taken care of." That night, Weston stayed up for a long time, thinking about what Teresa had said. He looked over at Quill, who was sleeping peacefully in his bed, and felt a wave of tenderness and sadness at the same time. He decided that if long walks were no longer possible, he would find other ways to spend time together. After all, Quill had been more than a guide. He had been his friend, his support through the toughest times, and now it was his turn to give that care back. From that day on, Weston changed his routine. They no longer walked through the city as they used to, but took short strolls to the nearest park, where they could sit under the sun and simply enjoy each other's company. Quill seemed content with these moments of calm, and although his steps were slower, he still came close to Weston every time they sat down, resting his head on his lap as he always did. One afternoon while they were at the park, Weston pulled a small rubber ball out of his pocket that they used to play with. Quill looked at it with interest, though not with the same excitement as before. "Remember this, buddy," Weston said, gently tossing it a few feet away. Quill got up slowly, walked over to the ball, picked it up carefully, and returned to Weston's side. He didn't run like he used to, but the joy in his eyes was still there. Weston realized that while things had changed, the essence of his relationship with Quill remained intact. It was about being together, sharing those simple moments that made life meaningful. Sitting on the park bench, watching Quill settle down beside him, Weston understood that it didn't matter how much time they had left together. What mattered was making each day count. The days became a series of small rituals. In the mornings, Weston made his coffee while Quill wandered over to the window, watching the sunlight fill the streets. Then they'd go for a short walk to the same quiet park, where sometimes they'd meet other dogs and their owners. They spent the afternoons at home, Weston reading out loud while Quill slept at his feet, as if the words lulled him to sleep. There was a new peace in Weston's life, an acceptance that everything, even the most beautiful things, must come to an end. But there was also gratitude, for each day he could spend with Quill, for every moment when his calm presence reminded him he wasn't alone. The sun fell gently over the city, casting a warm golden glow on the streets and buildings, and in the midst of that quiet radiance, Weston decided to do what he had been dreading for days. He had spent entire nights contemplating this decision, unable to sleep, his heart heavy with sorrow. But he knew he could no longer ignore the inevitable. Quill was tired, more tired than Weston wanted to admit, and it wasn't fair to ask him to keep bearing that weariness. It was time to let him rest. Teresa and Carlos had come to visit the week before. They knew Quill well, maybe better than anyone, and their words were kind but firm. "Weston," Teresa had said, her eyes filled with a tenderness that only people who understand life and death can have. "Quill has done more than anyone could have expected of him. He's been your friend, your guide, your support. But now, he needs you to be strong for him. He needs to rest." The words hit Weston's heart like a cold wave. Rest. There was a deep sadness in the thought that someone as full of life as Quill would need that kind of rest. But Weston knew Teresa was right. He couldn't hold on to Quill forever, no matter how much he wanted to. And so, on that sunny afternoon, he decided it would be their last walk together to the park. As they walked down the streets they had traveled so many times, Weston couldn't help but remember his early days with Quill. He recalled how he'd resisted depending on him, how he'd feared entrusting his life to an animal, and how, little by little, Quill had broken down every barrier, had illuminated every dark corner of his loneliness. Now, with each step they took, he felt the weight of time, the years and memories that trailed behind them like fallen leaves on the sidewalk. Quill walked slowly beside him, no longer with the agility of his youth, but still with that same calm and dignity that had always defined him. When they reached the park, Weston found his favorite bench, the one beneath an old tree that offered shade in summer and shelter on rainy days. He sat down slowly, and Quill, as if he knew this moment was special, settled next to him, resting his head on Weston's knees. The sun shone gently through the leaves, casting dancing shadows over them. Weston began to speak in a low voice, as if sharing a secret with a dear friend. "Remember, Quill, the first time I took you downtown, I thought we'd never make it across that busy avenue. But you, with that calm of yours, just went right on, no fear. And I kept going because you were there." As he spoke, he stroked Quill's soft fur, as if each touch was a way of thanking him for all those years of companionship. Quill closed his eyes, but he was still listening, as he always had, with infinite patience. Weston kept telling stories, small anecdotes of happy times, of sad moments that Quill had made more bearable just by being there. The park was almost empty. Only the rustling of the wind and an occasional bird's song accompanied Weston's words. It was as if the world had stopped just for them, giving them this last moment of peace together. "Thank you, Quill," Weston said, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Thank you for every day, for every step you took by my side. I can never repay you for all you've given me, but I hope you can feel how much I love you, how much you mean to me." He leaned forward and hugged Quill, feeling his warm body, his slow, steady breaths. And in that embrace, Weston let go of all the tears he'd been holding back. Tears of love, pain, gratitude. Quill remained still, allowing himself to be wrapped in Weston's embrace, and though he couldn't speak, his presence was enough. It was as if, in those final moments, he wanted to tell him that everything was all right, that he was at peace, that there was nothing to fear. His breathing grew slower, softer, until it finally stopped, like a whisper fading into the wind. Weston didn't know how long he sat there with Quill in his arms. The sun began to set, painting the sky a warm orange, and he still held his friend, unable to let go. He knew the time had come, but he couldn't imagine a world without Quill by his side. Finally, with a deep sadness pressing on his chest, he stood up and looked around. The park was unchanged, but for him, everything was different. He had lost his companion, his most loyal friend, and the emptiness he left behind was so vast, he didn't know how he would fill it. Days later, Teresa and Carlos helped Weston say goodbye to Quill in the way he deserved. They found a quiet spot under the same tree in the park where they used to sit, and there they laid Quill to rest. Weston placed a small plaque with his name and a simple inscription: "My faithful friend, my light in the darkness." He stood there, remembering all those moments they had shared. Time passed, and though Quill's absence still hurt, Weston found a way to carry on. There wasn't a day he didn't think about his friend, but instead of sadness, he began to feel something else: gratitude. Because of Quill, he had found a way to live again, to come out of the shadows he had hidden in after losing his sight. He had reconnected with people, learned to enjoy the little things in life. One morning, as he walked down the same streets he had once traveled with Quill, Weston felt the sun shining a bit warmer, the air smelling a bit sweeter. He realized that everything Quill had done for him was still there, in every step he took, in every smile he dared to show. Quill wasn't by his side anymore, but he had left an indelible mark on his heart, and that mark would stay with him forever. Weston understood then that the true essence of friendship isn't measured by how long it lasts, but by the impact it leaves behind. And Quill, his dear friend, had changed his life in a way he could never forget. With a gentle smile and a glance toward the sky, he whispered, "Thank you, friend. You'll always be with me." And so, even though his companion was gone, Weston found the strength to keep walking, knowing that every step, every day, was a tribute to everything Quill had taught him. The story of Weston and Quill is a moving tale about the deep and sincere connection between a human and an animal. From the beginning, we see how Weston, a man who had lost hope after losing his sight, finds in Quill not only a guide, but a true friend who accompanies and supports him every step of the way. Their relationship goes beyond that of a guide dog. Quill becomes the bond that allows Weston to reconnect with the world and rediscover the joy of living. The journey of Quill and Weston teaches us the importance of patience, understanding, and unconditional love. Quill shows that love isn't just expressed through words, but through actions, through silent companionship and constant support. The story reminds us that sometimes life's toughest moments are more bearable when we have someone by our side, even if that someone can't speak. The deepest lesson we can learn from this story is about loyalty and unwavering affection. Animals have the power to transform lives, and Quill's story shows us that, in the end, true love always endures, even beyond goodbye. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to let us know how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and accompany you on every step of your journey.